very convenient for these two when they're trying to move on with their careers that they're now going to stand there and say, I never agree with the war in Iraq. Well, where the hell were they when 1.7 million people were marching through the streets of London? Where were they when this country, the majority that I spoke to, were anti this war and saying so aggressively? For these guys to stand up here now and say, all along, we never thought this was a good idea, is some of the worst politicking I've seen in a very long time. And they deserve not to win because of what they've done with this Iraq thing. I would urge people not to vote for it, because you cannot do this. The war in Iraq was the great political story of the last 15 years. It remains one of the great foreign policy disasters this country has had, I think, by common consent. And it just sticks in my gullet that these politicians who were there at the time, they weren't in government, as they've made it very clear, but they were MPs and they were vocal about all sorts of issues. They just sat on their backsides and let people die. And it's unacceptable. Really is unacceptable.
I don't think they were MPs, actually, at the time the decision was made. But Ed Balls said of this, and Ed Balls is right to the heart of Labour, said it was a mistake. On the information we had, we shouldn't have prosecuted the war. On the information we had. So he does disagree. And Ed Miliband said it was a catastrophic loss of trust for us, for a lot of people, because you didn't give them time. What do you say to that?
I disagree.
And why are they saying this now?
I mean, first of all, Piers and I, we've argued about Iraq over many, many years. We're never, ever going to agree on it. I did support what Tony Blair and the Cabinet did, and I still do to this day. I think history will view it very, very differently. I think that in relation to the two Eds, and it's odd this contest with two Milibands and two Eds and all the rest of it, but if you can follow them, Ed Miliband...
Which one are you for, by the way?
I have said, and actually to go along with what Piers just said, this has reinforced my view in this. I've said I will back David Miliband because my view in this is who is the person most likely to beat David Cameron at the next general election. And I thought that, I like Ed Miliband and I like Ed Balls and they've got a lot of strengths, but I did think that at a time when the leadership election is starting, it is really important that all the candidates, as this coalition is getting off and it's doing a pretty fast job, it's really moving, and the Labour Party, as it selects a new leader, has really got to start focusing on an agenda for the future. And I think that there's nobody in this room, I suspect, who hasn't made up their mind about Iraq. And I do agree with Piers that I think if there were really strong feelings to be voiced about it, then they certainly had the access. And I don't recall hearing the strong feelings being voiced back then.
Max Hastings.
Well, I was one of the useful idiots who believed Alastair Campbell and Tony Blair when they told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I'm afraid it was the last time I believed Alastair, about whether it was Monday or Tuesday.
You called him the most duplicitous man in public life.
But he did agree to sit on the same panel.
I think I said that he and Peter Mandelson were the two most duplicitous.
Okay, right, so he was one of the two most duplicitous.
We've always been pointed at
that was partly, I guess, on the basis that I was one of those. I actually was a believer in New Labour before the Iraq War, and the Iraq War was what changed my mind.
But do you believe that still, that he's duplicitous, that he lives in a moral vacuum?
In the end, he was party to, as Piers has said, and I agree with Piers about this, there can be nothing more serious that a government can do than to take the nation to war under false pretenses.
Well,
that is what the government in which Alastair Campbell was complicit did.
All right, hold on, Alastair. Just answer the question about Ed Miliband and Ed Balls and why they're now criticising the war.
I think there is a moment when you've got to move on. The Labour Party needs now, where Alastair and I might even agree, is that it's time for the Labour Party to start thinking about how it's going to be in opposition to the Cameron government, not about how it's going to be in opposition to the last government, but to. And there is something slightly pathetic about the candidates for the next leader of the Labour Party arguing about who did what all those years ago. In the end, they've got to look ahead. Unless the Labour Party can look ahead, then it's not going to be a credible opposition to David Cameron.
Man in the third row in the check show.
I just want to say I'm kind of actually quite shocked that Alastair Campbell has said you'll back David Miliband on the grounds that he's most likely to beat David Cameron in the next election. Is that your reason for backing him? Shouldn't there be a bit more like belief than you actually believe it?
No, but that's, look, I know them all. I can absolutely state that I couldn't imagine myself voting for Diane Abbott. I don't think that if her politics had ever held sway in the Labour Party, we'd have had one day in government, let alone 13 years. I look at the Andy Burnham, Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, David Miliband. I think they're very, very good people. I think they've got the right values and so forth. But you have to make a judgment, and I'm in a position that I suppose is quite privileged. I know them all very, very well. So my own judgment is that of the four, based on what I know and what I see in them and the experience that they've had, that David is the most likely to be able to take the Labour Party. I think Max is absolutely right. We do have to start thinking about the future. This Lib Dem Conservative coalition, it's motoring a bit, and I think...
Before we move on too quickly, though, you did question Max saying that this war in Iraq was fought on false pretences. Yeah. Can I question that statement? Because quite clearly it was fought on false pretenses. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It may not be to your credit now, but that is a fact.
I'm not saying that's not a fact. I'm not saying that when the invasion took place...
You accept it was fought on false pretenses?
No, because false pretenses suggest that we were...
Suggests that we were conned?
No, it suggests we were misled, and you weren't, because the...
We were misled?
No.
We were misled?
No, you were not misled. You were not
misled. We were told there were weapons of mass destruction by our government, by you.
Can I answer this thing?
Yes, or answer it briefly if you would, and I'll come to Mehmet. Yes, go on.
There's a whole... Tony Blair's the Prime Minister. He's sitting there. He's seen this intelligence, which has all been published. People can go and see why he made the decision that he did. And he's there in the context post-September the 11th, genuinely worried because of his record.
I'm not saying you deliberately lied.
That is what false pretenses says.
No, it's not. What it means is the premise of the war...
by the way. Max is. Duplicity is lying.
Okay, I'm not calling you a liar. I'm just saying you were wrong. And actually, since at the time you fought very, very hard, we're at the BBC, to get the BBC to apologise, maybe you could apologise for just being wrong. Being wrong.
Because, look, we disagreed.
You were wrong.
We're wrong about the weapons of mass destruction.
Well, that's the key part. That was what you fought the war on.
It was about disarming Saddam Hussein and forcing him to face up to his obligations under United Nations law.
That wasn't why you fought the war.
Going right the way back
to the war because you said to the British public he had weapons of mass destruction, and he did.
All right,
and that's just wrong.
Alastair Campbell, you said you supported David Miliband for the leadership of the Labour Party. Do you agree with him when he says, but if we'd known then what we know now, if we'd have known Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction, there would have been no UN resolutions, no vote in the House of Commons, no war. Do you agree with him on that?
It would have, certainly, yeah, I do. But I don't accept, what I think that both Piers and Max are trying to say, even if they say they're not, is that we were essentially trying to mislead the British public.
Is that what you're saying, Max?
I'm absolutely sure of it. I'm sure of anything. I will bet my socks that the Iraq War inquiry, whatever else it concludes, will conclude that Tony Blair gave private undertakings to George Bush about his willingness to support an American invasion of Iraq, and then produced, with your energetic assistance, a dossier which sexed up the intelligence in order to convince the British public
about that inquiry. There's been three inquiries into that already, and I've been cleared by every single one of them. And you can speculate as to what the Chilcot inquiry will say. I would prefer to let them continue to take their evidence, and then we'll see. But it's very, very easy for people to get on their high horses and say, well, if they'd have been there, they'd have made the right decision. Tony Blair was the guy, because John will know as having...
But it's very, very easy of you to sit here now. And as I say, I'm not accusing you of lying, or Tony Blair. I don't know whether you lied or not, but I've known you a long time, and I've always liked you, and you've never lied to me particularly.
Yes, he has. Yes, he has.
Actually,
you accused him of lying.
He has lied to me, but never about anything as serious as this.
And you accused him of sacking you.
But I don't think it's...
all sorts of things.
I don't think... I think it's kind of irrelevant to the point that I'm trying to argue here, which is simply this. You were wrong. Whether you meant to be or not, you were wrong.
We were wrong about the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction on which this decision was partly based. It wasn't just about WMD, it was the whole history of Saddam, it was the fact that you were dealing with a brutal
dictator. But you only got the resolution for war because of WMD.
There have been resolutions going way back.
Has this created a lack of trust? Did this create the lack of trust with Labour that led to the election result that you got? Or do you think it wasn't a factor in people's minds? They didn't trust you particularly and Tony Blair?
I think it would be impossible to think there wasn't certainly political damage, but just remember, just a minute though, Max, we won an election after the Iraq War under Tony Blair, and including after the Hutton inquiry, and including after all the difficult circumstances of that. So I think and all I ask of people, all I say to people, is I do understand how people reach a different opinion. Piers and I used to argue about this literally on a daily basis, because he was then editor of the Daily Mirror, I was doing my job, I was trying to persuade him, I knew it was an impossible task. He was trying to persuade me we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. And he was doing it, I think, genuinely out of a belief that he sort of felt a strong duty to say